I'll just mention one more thing. So far, it has been just sort of the day-to-day, but I want to also think forward-looking, right? Mm-hmm. Someone who's in recovery is planning for, things that are out in front of them, right? Think holidays, especially this time of year, family gatherings, business trips, vacations. I have a lot of guys who are in business.
Travel.
Yeah, travel. Mm-hmm. Travel for work. Or, what do the business trips look like? And they look a lot different in recovery than they did, usually, than they did before. And so going from a place of being reactive to a place of being proactive.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, the co-host of this great production, together with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I was just talking about my journey here from Chicago. It went great.
It's been good. It's been very good. Well, we have two special guests with us on the podcast today, direct from the Faithful and True team here. We've got Chris and Elizabeth Hardesty.
Yes.
There you go.
There we go.
Ready to get after it. That's
High
right.
five.
Yes.
There's been so much demand since the last time that the two of you were on that we really went to great lengths to make sure we could get you
Thanks,
back
Randy.
again.
Thanks.
Actually, that's not true. To get on y'all's schedule is incredibly challenging.
Exactly
Y'all
right.
are
It's
in
good to be
demand.
here.
We're thrilled to have you.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to do a couple of podcasts today. We're going to start with the first one, which is we're going to talk about how the husband shares with his wife his recovery plan and what he plans to do to pursue sobriety, boundaries that he's putting in place, and positive behaviors going forward in your healing journey.
Yeah, for those of you that have been with us for a while, we've been doing a series on some very specific things that husbands can do to begin to rebuild trust. Mm-hmm. And all along the way, we've talked about this fact that that's probably one of the biggest questions that a wife has, both in her first appointments or when she comes to the workshop. How can I ever trust my husband again, given this level of deception?
Yes.
So we want to address some of those things. And so today we are talking about the role that the husband can play in being open and honest, transparent around what his recovery plan is. So probably a great place to start would be, what is a recovery plan? Mm-hmm. How do we define that? How do we talk about it? And what are some of the tools that a man could use to create a recovery plan?
Okay, yeah. So I can take that one.
Sure.
Yep. And so I think it's just really important to consider a variety of pieces that contribute to the recovery plan. Okay, so not that long ago, as a start, Pat Carnes, was the founder of Sexual Addiction Recovery. He did some research around like what for his clients, what were the ingredients that made them the most successful. And I bring a little bit of that to today's podcast, but then also some of our own insight as well. And it turns out there's a lot of overlap in what we recommend and what Pat years ago actually brought to the table as well. One of those is going to be a primary therapist, okay? I call that kind of the person who's going to, the guide, or the person who's going to be helping the client do the heavy, so-called heavy lifting, mm-hmm. Really helping them dig. What are the wounds? What are the root issues around the addiction? Community. You can't get well without community. It's just true, right? So community is a key piece of this. A couple types of community that we might look at. One would be maybe a therapy group led by a therapist, and maybe a 12-step group or a peer group. There are lots of programs out there in lots of ways, but you've got to be in community. Right. And you may find community outside of a recovery group also.
One thing I would say is the peer-led group, typically there is some sort of curriculum that is leading it. Mm-hmm. Not always, but there are a lot of resources out there that men can find in their church or in other areas. You mentioned SA, Sexaholics Anonymous, or SAA, or SLA.
Right.
There's a lot of options, and they're driven by the White Book or whatever book that they're using. There are also opportunities where men just get together to talk about their recovery. It's not necessarily driven by a curriculum.
Sure.
And it is good to have community like that, but sometimes if that's the only thing I have,
Yeah.
and I would say most of the time, if that's the only thing I have, it doesn't move me forward. It's great to be with others, but I do need some voice that's kind of pushing me forward in my recovery.
Yeah, that's why the therapy group piece is so important, or having someone who's gone before you, and can really lead you in the process. So community is just so important. But also, we've talked a lot about in our podcast brain health, and just it's really hard to get any sort of traction in recovery if I've got mental health issues blocking or something like. So getting at issues that we see a lot, like ADHD or mood disorders, like anxiety, depression, these kinds of things. We need to take a good look at the brain health and the mental health of that person. The faith journey, right? Where for us around here, Faithful and True, like we believe that's a core component, right? So what does the faith journey look like? And I'm a big proponent of a day-to-day plan, or I might call it a playbook. What is your day-to-day routine going to look like? I like to ask guys or teach guys at the workshop, even or even individually. What is recovery look like day to day?
Right. Well, I think a great question is, today, what am I doing to support my recovery? In the early days of my recovery, I kind of had a principle. Each week I was going to do 3 big things. So that would be a therapy group I was in, that would be the essay meeting I went to, and that would be the appointment that I had with my therapist. But then each day I would do something. I would read, I would have a conversation with someone, I would meet someone for coffee, so that every day I'm being reminded of my recovery and the importance of staying engaged in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think we've got, kind of in this topic, we've got the idea of boundaries and we've got the idea of positive behaviors. That's where they play in. Day to day, I've got positive behaviors like you're talking about, Greg, the things that I'm really trying to do to implement recovery. And then those are in addition to those, I've also got boundaries, good solid boundaries in place as well. I'll just mention one more thing. So far, it has been just sort of the day-to-day, but I want to also think forward-looking, right? Someone who's in recovery is planning for, things that are out in front of them, right? Think holidays, especially this time of year, family gatherings, business trips, vacations. I have a lot of guys who are in business.
Travel.
Yeah, travel for work, or what do the business trips look like? And they look a lot different in recovery than they did usually than they did before. And so, going from a place of being reactive to a place of being proactive.
Well, and I would also say that even in looking forward, one of the things that I loved about the therapy group that I went to is each of us were responsible every week when we came to identify what we were working on. What in my life, using our language, what in my life is limiting me in becoming the man that God created me to be? So do I want to work on my anxiety? Do I want to work on my depression? Do I want to work on some of my unhealthy patterns of relationship or my placating? But kind of that in front of me, this is what I'm moving towards. And I do think without that looking forward, we can easily get lost and start wandering around. So all of that to say, this podcast is about how having a recovery plan, being clear, can begin to build trust. So what's it like for a wife when a husband is able to regularly just have an open conversation about the things that Chris talked about?
Well, I think one thing I'm noticing, Greg, as you and Chris are both talking, is even just some of the words you're using, my, I. There's just this sense of ownership of this is my recovery plan. I am owning my recovery. And I think it's just a huge, huge gift to a wife when she's able to hear an offering from a husband to her of this is the plan that I am creating for myself. This is the way that I am choosing to steward my hoop. This is the way that I'm choosing to show up in my recovery. It helps her. I think it does help to build trust. It helps to let go and surrender of like, okay, I don't have to get over there and micromanage this for him or give him a list of things he needs to do or give suggestions because I have a sense, I can feel that he's got it.
Right.
He's taking responsibility for this.
Yep. One thing that I would say, I remember the early days of my recovery, I was clueless. I did not know what I was supposed to be doing. And so I was fortunate that I did have someone early in my life that served kind of a role of encourager, coach, mentor. And so he was helping me with, what if you try this? What if you tried this? And what was good about it is I was still the one that was proactive in reaching out to the groups. I was the one who made contact with the therapist or checked in about that workshop. But at least I wasn't trying to figure it out on my own. I couldn't have figured it out on my own. And I do think that just assumed in all of this is that the man is surrounded by other men who are a little bit further down the journey that are letting him know the things that would be helpful. Because you don't know what you don't know,
Right, which
and you
is
don't
understandable.
necessarily have the questions yet. And so wise men helping you with that is huge. We talk about at the workshop that you are responsible for leading your own recovery team or your own recovery plan, and you don't lead alone. You have other wise men who are leading their recovery teams, and you can use them as a support to get the resources that you need.
I think one thing I hear, Greg, that I appreciate so much is I hear in you and your story, there was such a humility to say, I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
And so finding other men, right? I see you smirking.
Yeah,
You're
well,
smiling.
I'm thinking, was it humility or was it, there was
Maybe
some
a little
that.
bit of both.
But it was just to be so overwhelmed by
yeah.
the chaos,
I don't
the
know what I'm
uncertainty.
doing.
I don't know what the next step is. And so being open, I think, is huge.
Being open, yes. There is a humility to that. There is a vulnerability to that. I think something else that I hear that was true for you is you weren't going to Beth to ask her what the steps were.
Well, there's another smile. We weren't really talking at that point. So
That wasn't an option.
Yeah, and I often say that, the separation between Beth and I was so significant that it really was clear that I was going to do this for myself and I was going to do this for my boys. It wasn't about me trying to do something to win her back or to get her approval or permission. I often say the best gift that Beth gave me early on was the gift of no hope, because that made it very clear if I was going to do this, it wasn't to save my marriage because I thought that ship had sailed. It really was because this is something I wanted for myself. And then when Beth and I reconciled, I could bring that determination into our relationship that was already in place.
And as I heard Chris outline those first points of here's how I'm putting my healing journey together, it struck me that it would be beneficial to both you and to Elizabeth. It's just like, if I do this, it's going to have a positive effect on her as well as it will be on you. So it's like you're doing double duty.
But here's the complication. It is beneficial to our spouse. It is helpful for our spouse, and yet it can't be motivated by our spouse. That, yes, we've talked about this idea that if my only motivation is to do recovery to save my marriage, more than likely it won't save my marriage. But if I recognize that by doing recovery and being committed to becoming the person God created me to be, the benefit of that is the best chance for my marriage to be saved. The best gift I can give my spouse is my sobriety. The best gift I can give my spouse is my transparency. And so if recovery brings me those things and then I'm able to offer them to my spouse, that's a very different energy than I'm doing this to appease or placate or even woo my spouse back.
Absolutely.
And do you think that women can tell the difference when a man is motivated for his recovery plan, something within himself, versus trying to appease or placate his spouse?
I think you certainly can. I think there's just a sense of being able to feel and trust when it's intrinsically motivated, when it's something within him where he really is owning it. Like, I know this is what I need. I know these are the boundaries I need to set for myself. I know these are the safe people I'm going to bring in my life, versus more of a placating stance of I'm doing this to check the box or to make sure that you're okay.
Right. Now, at the workshop, this is a piece that you teach. We talk about the 3-circle plan. That is not unique to Faithful and True. That's something that is used in a lot of recovery communities. And yet we have found it incredibly helpful in creating a visual that allows men to see what it looks like to develop a recovery plan. We do have podcasts about the 3-circle plan, so we don't have to go into detail about that, but just kind of cast a vision of what the 3-circle plan is and how it plays into some of the things you've talked about.
Sure, yeah. Well, it really is defining, those positive behaviors that you want to engage in. Think of 3 concentric circles, okay? So we've got that middle circle is what we would call our red circle, and that's the circle we want to stay away from. That would be a lack of sobriety, okay? And then the circle I'm describing is the outermost circle, but prior to that, the green circle. Those are the positive behaviors, the things I want to engage in. And then in between the green and the red circle, kind of at the middle of those three concentric circles, that's the zone, right? That's the zone that we need to be careful of. It's the warning zone. Caution, yellow, caution.
Right.
It's a stoplight analogy, And so I think at the outset of recovery, that is the most important zone or circle to be aware of, because that's the key word actually is awareness. That I'm aware that I'm triggered, or that I'm aware that I'm in a ritual, or that I'm aware that I'm feeling a certain way. But many of the guys that are coming through here just don't have a ton of awareness around what's going on. And then building the positive behaviors then into that green circle. And it's something I think we like to emphasize to the men at the workshop is that the three circle plan and the positive behaviors that we're looking for, and that a wife might actually see as well, and others will see, they're a means to an end. We're not talking about doing your way through recovery. We're talking about doing your way so that it informs some sort of transformation. How is he transforming in recovery? So that's in a nutshell, that's the three circles.
Right.
And I like to couple that with a recovery plan, kind of that day-to-day, what does that look like? And I think that's the first thing I do with men, is to get some sort of a foundation, a structure, a framework, if you will, in place before we do any of the heavy lifting, or before, like you've got to be supported in some way. And that's, you kind of got to get, what does your playbook look like? And those are the pieces that we're talking about here in terms of recovery plan.
So kind of in a simplistic way, the yellow circle, those are the things that I need to get out of my life, that I need to avoid. The green are those things that I need to bring into my life.
I would say the yellow circle are things that I might need to jettison. They are also things that I need to learn how to steward well or handle. So we're always going to be triggered. It's a matter of how do I deal with that trigger.
Right.
So it's stewarding, and there are some things within my control that I can get rid of. Right.
So for a wife, would you say that, and maybe it's both, but what creates the most anxiety? When it seems as if the husband isn't attuned to the yellow circle, kind of those triggers, those rituals, the things that need to be avoided, or if the green circle is absent, it doesn't seem like he's really doing things to support his recovery, and you might not be able to choose between the two. But do you have a sense of what conversation you have the most with, or where the energy is the most?
Yeah, I guess my response right now is I do feel like it's both. I think something I hear often from wives that can be really difficult is if there seems to be like a passivity coming from their husband, and just a lack of, you talked about awareness, like a lack of awareness or intentionality around really owning for himself, like what is in my yellow circle, what is creating vulnerabilities and triggers within me, and the stewarding of those things. And then I think absolutely along with that is if a wife is sensing that her husband is not stewarding his green circle, he's not reaching out to other safe men, he's not doing therapy, he's not taking care of himself, his physical and emotional health. I mean, all of those I think are additional concerns.
Right. And Chris, you kind of alluded to this. We often talk about the difference between doing recovery and being in recovery. Right. And so using our language, it's not what you're doing, it's what part of you is doing it. Is your survivor man trying to do recovery to appease or perform or placate? Or is it your wise man that's really being in recovery, and in that being is being transformed? And my sense is wives may not have that language, but they can intuitively know whether their husband is doing something just to perform or placate versus really being transformed through the experience.
Yes. And I think one thing I just want to toss in here that I see often, I think that is part of maybe the journey for the wives and where we need support as well, is learning, how do I give space? How do I, in some ways, detach or give space to my husband and to his hoop so that there can be some ownership around his own recovery?
Right.
I really sense, and it makes sense. Again, I think it makes so much sense early on for a wife of why there maybe is this fear, this anxiety, this overstepping of wanting to know or manage or give advice or be very helpful in some different suggestions of what he could do. And yet I think we often see just that dynamic where it can end up hindering him.
It backfires.
Yes, from
frankly,
really that
more
sense
often
of
than not.
that
Yeah.
sense of taking agency over his own program.
Well, and it really, I'm glad that you brought up that agency piece. So it makes sense. This is kind of the couple's dance where, rightly so, she has a lot of anxiety and fear about how this goes because she has identified she's willing to be open to consider the relationship. There's a lot at stake. She has been hurt. Trust has been broken. He's trying to find his way. Part of the pattern has been some passivity, maybe some placating on his own part. So having enough patience to wait and see if he can find agency within himself.
Yeah.
And the more that the spouse intervenes early on with encouragement or direction, the less opportunity he has to discover that. But I also want to validate, kind of like what you said, it makes sense that that wife wants to step in and try to organize, and at times it can be support, direct, whatever it is, because there is so much at stake. So what would be your encouragement that a wife comes in and she has the concerns that you've expressed, that it doesn't seem like he's fully engaged, he doesn't seem to be proactive and really pursuing the resources that he needs, or there's some lingering things from some old patterns that cause her to feel unsafe. How do you help a wife provide support, direction, encouragement from her hoop versus getting into her husband's hoop?
Well, I think one way is just as we talk about for him to be supported. I think the same thing for her, to really be supported by a therapist, by other wise women, just by a safe community. Because I think it's true that as maybe she is waiting or kind of backing off a little bit, there is going to be some increased fear and anxiety. And so how does she steward that? How does she stay supported and take care of herself during that, I think, is really important. And then I think one of the things we're going to talk about here is just what are the ways that she can certainly have her voice. And what we say here is like speaking from her hoop, like how can she still from her hoop ask things or check things out? It doesn't mean we want to render her voiceless, that she just has to be completely voiceless over there and not say anything. But it's this fine line of how do I speak these things, these concerns I have or these needs that I have from my hoop, while at the same time giving my husband the agency that he needs to be able to answer that.
Right. And part of the thing that we talk about is it is so important that the husband is active in communicating what he is doing, that he's checking in that he's going to his meeting, that he's reached out to his guys, that he does have another appointment with his therapist. Because in the absence of information, it makes perfect sense the wife is going to start to speculate, and in the early days of recovery, and maybe in some of the later days of recovery, not assume the best.
Yes.
And so to bring that clarity of, these are the things that I'm doing, that's part of the way that if we genuinely want to serve our spouse in our recovery, is by offering that information so that she understands what effort and energy is being put into it.
Yes.
If an appointment gets canceled, that he's able to communicate why that appointment was canceled. Sometimes it's on the therapist's part. Maybe it was on his part. But then the plan that, yes, and I've rescheduled another one for it.
Yeah.
That information helps to remind the spouse that he's still doing it and desiring it, and he's on track.
If he's changing one of his boundaries, if anything, if anything in his recovery plan is changing or something's happening, he is bringing that to her and offering that, right? She's not having to find that out. She's not having to discover that. She's not having to try to ask a million questions to get that information. What's really going to help her not to go to a place of detective mode or hypervigilance is when there is that offering. He's taking that risk of offering that information, that honest information to her.
So when he takes that risk and offers the information or gives her visibility into his recovery, what makes it safe for him to do that? I mean, that's probably a whole podcast in and of itself. But I mean, what do you think? What do you think would be conducive then to him offering information or create a safe landing pad for that?
I mean, I think this is part of our work is how do we hear, him in the offering of that? How do we receive that information without having a strong reaction. Doesn't mean we have to necessarily like it or that it's not going to, provoke some anxiety or some fear within us. But again, how can we let him be where he is? Like, okay, that's one thing I often say to the wives is, okay, that's information, right? That's information about what he's choosing and how he's stewarding his hoop. And then to check in with, like, slow down and check in with ourselves of, okay, what is that causing me to feel and what might I need? And now what might I need? And I don't need to just react or in that moment be really aggressive in my response, but it may take me some time to have to think about, okay, how do I feel about that? And what might my next step need to be based on that?
And I know in our recovery that was a big that's precisely what made me approaching you and offering information to you and giving you visibility into my recovery. That's what made it doable. Was it wasn't, you didn't always agree necessarily with my recovery plan or the way I had things set up, but you were safe for me to bring that information. I knew you would go and go and check that out if that was something you needed to work on. But it continued to be safe along the way, and so I'm more and more willing, to kind of exercise that agency and find that agency and sort of rise up and not over you, but with you as a partner and offer you information.
One thing I would say too is we're not always going to show up with our best selves. And so there may be a time that a husband offers something and the wife's reaction may not be the best, not what she would even desire for herself. We cannot use that as an excuse to just give up.
Yeah.
We have to find our own strength or determination to bring back information later, try it again. Because if the person in recovery has to do it perfectly, if the spouse has to do it perfectly, then it's not going to go anywhere because none of us can do it perfectly. There has to be kind of an overarching sense that this person is for me. And even if this is difficult right now, if I can just hold on to the fact that my spouse is for me, then that may help me re-engage it the next time.
Absolutely.
I would also say that in this, and this probably would come better from you, Elizabeth, but this idea that whatever your spouse is doing, there can always be more. That's just true. And to be able to appreciate what it is that he is doing. And I know that it may not be much, but to get some sort of validation and appreciation when it is possible. And in the early days, I just tell men, do not expect any appreciation, any gratitude, any thank yous. If you get it, that's great. But for a lot of women, they're not thankful for his recovery because they're still in the pain and the chaos of the addiction. So that's going to come from your community. But in time, when a spouse is able to affirm and validate for the recovery plan and the work that the husband is doing, it goes a long way. I know that it did for me.
Well, I see that we are approaching our end time for this particular podcast, and we really want to thank you, Chris and Elizabeth, for your wisdom and experience and input today, and Greg, as always. You were great.
Speechless, aren't you?
Speechless. He's drinking new special coffee we ordered for him. But we want to say to our loyal listeners and viewers that we really appreciate you. We appreciate you taking your time to listen to these podcasts, to experience them. And our hope is that you will benefit from the wisdom and experience that you're hearing from our people, Chris and Elizabeth and Greg, today. If this podcast has opened your eyes to some additional help or support that you need, we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of resources available to you. You'll find over 400 podcasts, much like this one, to give you some additional guidance. We also have all the information and registration available for our 3-day intensive workshops. We do the Men's Journey Workshop every month. And we invite you to take a look at those details. You can register right online, and we hold it every month here at Faithful and True in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. We also have the workshops for the spouses, for the women's. That's the Women's Journey Workshop, and then we have the Couples Journey Workshop. And we do those about 3 times a year, not as frequently as we do for the men, but they're impactful events, and we invite you to check those out. So until we join you again next time, we hope that this coming week for you is going to be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.